The night it all began, the wind howled like a wounded animal. I sat alone in the kitchen, nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee. The farmhouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that crept up on you and clung to your skin like damp air. My parents had turned in early, and I was left to my own devices, keeping an eye on the storm rolling in from the west. It was supposed to be a bad one. I didn't see the meteorite fall, not exactly. I heard it, a sharp crack that split the sky, followed by a low rumble that made the windows tremble in their frames. The ground beneath me shuddered as if something heavy had slammed into the earth just beyond our fields. I shot up from my chair, my heart pounding. A flash of light lit up the night outside, so bright it could have been day for a brief moment. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and headed for the door, every nerve in my body screaming that this was something I shouldn't ignore. The air outside smelled burnt, and there was an acrid taste in the back of my throat as I jogged toward the fields. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the darkness, cutting across the familiar shapes of the barn and the old oak tree. But tonight, everything felt different. Wrong. I reached the edge of the field and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the corn rows, was a smoking crater. Something had crashed into the earth with enough force to carve out a pit the size of a small car. The meteorite itself was a jagged, obsidian-like rock, glowing faintly with an eerie green light. Wisps of smoke curled off its surface, disappearing into the night air. I took a step closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I knew I should turn around and run back to the house. Call someone, anyone. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from that glowing stone. It hummed, low and rhythmic, like the beating of a heart. Then the corn around me began to rustle. At first I thought it was just the wind picking up, but the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful. Something was in the field with me. I swung the flashlight around, catching a glimpse of movement just beyond the beam's reach. My breath caught in my throat as I saw something slither through the stalks. Something that shouldn't be there. Before I could react, a low growl rumbled from behind me. I spun around just in time to see Bessie, our old cow, emerge from the shadows. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her eyes were milky white, her skin stretched tight over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. Her once placid face was twisted into a grotesque snarl, her mouth dripping with something dark and viscous. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I tried to put distance between us. But Bessie charged faster than any cow should be able to move. I barely had time to dive to the side before she barreled past me, her hooves tearing up the soil where I had just been standing. My heart was pounding in my ears as I scrambled to my feet. I aimed the flashlight at Bessie, but she was already gone, disappearing into the darkness of the field. The growls, however, didn't stop. They were all around me now, low, hungry, unnatural. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I could hear them behind me, the soft patter of hooves, the rustle of corn, and that horrible wet growling. The house was just ahead, the porch light flickering like a dying firefly. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning with effort. As I reached the porch steps, I glanced back. Just for a second. And that's when I saw them. Not just Bessie, but the others. The chickens, the pigs, even the barn cats. They were all there, their bodies twisted and decayed, their eyes glowing with that same eerie green light. They were coming for me. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it with trembling hands. My parents were standing in the hallway, confused and groggy from sleep. But one look at my face and they knew something was very, very wrong. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. All I could manage was, "They're out there! They're coming!" We barricaded the doors and windows as best as we could. The growls and scratching echoed outside, a constant reminder that whatever had come from that meteorite wasn't going to stop. Not until it had consumed everything. As the hours passed, the noise grew louder, more insistent. Every thud against the walls sent shivers down my spine. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the scratching started to come from below us, from beneath the floorboards. That was when I realized it wasn't just the animals. The soil itself was infected. Everything that touched it would rise again. And we were trapped in the middle of it all. That was the moment I knew. We were never getting out of here alive. The scratching from beneath the floorboards grew louder, more frantic. My mom pressed her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with terror. My dad stood by the front door, a shotgun in his hands, though I knew it wouldn't be enough. Not against whatever this was. I could see it in his face. He didn't know what to do either. None of us did. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't stay. Whatever's out there, it's spreading." My dad looked at me, his jaw clenched tight. "And go where? We're surrounded. We'd never make it to the truck." He was right. The noises outside were relentless. The shuffling of hooves and claws, the low guttural moans that made my stomach turn. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse through the boarded-up windows, just a flash of movement, a pair of glowing eyes, a twisted silhouette. They were out there, circling the house, waiting. Then there was a loud crash from the back of the house. Wood splintering, metal groaning. My heart stopped for a second and I turned toward the noise. The old root cellar door. Something was trying to break in from underground. "They're in the cellar!" I shouted, backing away from the hallway that led to the basement stairs. My dad rushed toward the back of the house, gripping the shotgun so tight his knuckles turned white. I followed close behind, my mom trailing after us, fear etched into every line on her face. We reached the basement door just as it began to rattle violently on its hinges. Whatever was down there, it was strong. Far too strong for something that should be dead. "Get the salt!" my dad barked, his voice tight with panic. Get all of it. Salt. It was a desperate idea. One we'd heard in old stories, salt to keep the dead at bay. But right now it was all we had. I sprinted to the kitchen, yanking open cupboards and grabbing every container of salt I could find. By the time I got back to the basement door, my dad had already piled heavy furniture in front of it. But it wouldn't hold for long. The wood was splintering, the door beginning to bow inward as if something on the other side was battering it with inhuman force. We poured the salt along the doorframe, making a thick line across the threshold. I wasn't sure if it would work, but it was our last hope. As soon as we finished, the pounding stopped. Silence fell over the house, an eerie, suffocating quiet that made my skin crawl. We all stood there, frozen, waiting for the next attack, but it never came. At least not from the basement. A blood-curdling scream shattered the silence, echoing through the night. It was high-pitched, inhuman, filled with agony. I'd never heard anything like it. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she backed away from the window. The scream came again, louder this time, and then something else. A deep, throaty snarl that vibrated through the walls. My dad moved to the window, pulling back a corner of the curtain just enough to peek outside. His face paled and he staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. "God help us," he whispered. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me not to, but I couldn't stop myself. I took a step forward, just enough to glance outside, and what I saw nearly made me drop the salt shaker from my hands. The animals were tearing each other apart. The undead livestock, the chickens, the pigs, even Bessie. They were in the yard, fighting in a frenzy of claws and teeth and hooves. Blood sprayed across the dirt, pooling into dark, slick puddles. Bessie's head twisted unnaturally as she bit down on one of the pigs, ripping it apart with her bare teeth. The chickens swarmed the scene, their beaks covered in gore, tearing at whatever flesh they could find. It was a massacre, a twisted, grotesque slaughter that defied reason. But that wasn't what terrified me the most. No, it was the fact that, despite the carnage, the animals wouldn't stay down. Every time one was torn to shreds, its body would shudder, then slowly begin to stitch itself back together. Limbs reattached, flesh knit itself over broken bones, and they rose again, more twisted and deformed than before. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to go now." My dad nodded, his face grim. "Through the back door. We'll make a run for the truck. Grab what you can." We didn't have time to think. My mom rushed to the closet, pulling out coats and bags. I grabbed the car keys from the hook near the door, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. Then, just as we were about to make our move, the front door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Something had broken through. We spun around, and there it stood, a figure, tall and thin, its body covered in ragged clothing, skin peeling away in patches to reveal raw, rotting flesh beneath. Its eyes glowed with that sickly green light, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, black ichor dripping from its lips. It wasn't one of the animals. It was a man, or at least it had been. Before we could react, the thing lunged at us with a speed that defied logic. My dad fired the shotgun, the blast echoing through the house, but the creature barely stumbled. It kept coming, its bony fingers reaching for us, its jaw unhinging with a sickening crack. We bolted for the back door, barely staying ahead of the thing. As we crashed through the kitchen, I heard another window shatter behind us. They were everywhere now, breaking through the walls, the windows, the doors. The house was no longer safe. We burst out into the night, the cold air hitting us like a slap to the face. The truck was just a few yards away, but it felt like miles. The creatures were behind us, their snarls and groans growing louder, closer. And then, just as we reached the truck, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. Laughter. High-pitched, echoing laughter. But it wasn't coming from the creatures. It was coming from beneath the earth. From the soil. The very ground we stood on was laughing at us. And that's when I knew it was too late. The farm was alive, and it wanted us dead. We piled into the truck, slamming the doors shut behind us. My dad fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he jammed them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. But before he could throw the truck into gear, something heavy slammed against the side of the vehicle, rocking it on its wheels. I glanced out the window, and my breath caught in my throat. The undead man who had broken through our door was there. His body twisted at an impossible angle, his face pressed against the glass, grinning with that awful ichor-dripping smile. His eyes glowed in the darkness, and he began pounding on the window with bone-cracking force.
Go, go!
I screamed, my voice rising in panic. My dad didn't need any more encouragement. He threw the truck into drive and slammed his foot on the gas. The tires spun in the mud for a moment before finding traction, and we lurched forward. The creature fell away, disappearing into the darkness as we sped down the dirt road that led away from the farm. But we weren't safe, not yet. The entire farm was infected, and as we tore down the road, I saw them in the headlights, more of them. The animals, the people, the things that had once been alive but were now twisted and rotting, with that same eerie green glow in their eyes. They were everywhere, shambling out of the fields, crawling out of the soil, dragging themselves toward us with relentless hunger. I could hear my mom sobbing softly in the back seat, whispering prayers under her breath. My dad's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. But there was no escape. Not really. We all knew it. The road stretched on for miles, winding through the darkened fields and past the thick woods that bordered our farm. Normally it was a peaceful drive, the kind where you could lose yourself in the quiet beauty of the countryside. But tonight, it felt like we were driving straight into hell. The laughter followed us, growing louder, more maniacal. It wasn't just in the ground anymore. It was in the air, in the trees, in our heads. It surrounded us, filling the cab of the truck with a suffocating sense of dread. Then, as we rounded a bend in the road, the truck's headlights caught something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, tall, gaunt, and draped in what looked like the tattered remnants of a farmer's coat. Its face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but I could see the glow of its eyes, burning with that sickly green light. My dad swerved to avoid it, but the truck skidded on the wet road, careening out of control. We spun wildly, the world outside a blur of darkness and rain, until finally we crashed into a ditch with a bone-jarring impact. The airbags deployed with a loud whoosh, knocking the breath from my lungs. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound the hiss of the engine as it sputtered to a stop. But then the laughter returned, closer now, louder, echoing all around us. And beneath it, I could hear the shuffling, the groaning, the scratching of nails on metal. They were coming for us. "We have to move," my dad gasped, struggling to free himself from the deflated airbag. "Get out of the truck, now!" I unbuckled my seatbelt with trembling hands and pushed the door open, stumbling out into the night. The rain had turned into a fine mist, hanging in the air like a ghostly shroud. The woods loomed on either side of the road, dark and foreboding, but it was our only option. We couldn't stay here. The others followed, my mom clutching her coat tight around her as she stepped into the mud, her eyes wide with fear. My dad grabbed the shotgun from the cab and motioned for us to follow him toward the trees. We moved quickly, not daring to look back at the road behind us. But we didn't have to. The sounds were enough to tell us that the creatures were closing in. I could hear the wet slap of their feet in the mud, the low guttural growls that sent shivers down my spine. They were relentless, driven by some insatiable hunger that defied reason. We plunged into the woods, the branches tearing at our clothes, the underbrush grabbing at our legs like skeletal hands. The darkness was thick here, oppressive, but we had no choice. We had to keep moving. "Just keep going," my dad urged, his voice tight with fear. "Don't stop, no matter what." We stumbled through the trees, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle in the leaves sounded like footsteps. The laughter had faded, but it was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to burst through at any moment. And then, from somewhere up ahead, came a different sound, crying. It was faint at first, barely audible over the noise of the forest. But as we pushed deeper into the woods, it grew louder. It was a child's cry, weak, pitiful, and full of fear. My heart clenched in my chest. There was someone else out here, someone alive. "Did you hear that?" my mom whispered, her voice trembling. "I hear it," my dad replied, his face pale. "But we need to keep moving. It could be a trap." "A trap?" I asked, horrified. "What if it's real? What if someone needs our help?" My dad hesitated, his eyes scanning the darkness around us. The crying grew louder, more desperate. It sounded so real, so human. "We can't just leave them," I pleaded. "Please." He looked at me, then at my mom, who was nodding in agreement, tears streaming down her face. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "All right, but we move quickly. If anything seems off, we run, understand?" We all nodded, and together, we followed the sound of the crying deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. The crying led us to a small clearing, where we found the source of the noise. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, sitting on the ground with her knees pulled to her chest. She was covered in mud, her clothes torn, her hair matted with leaves and twigs. She looked up at us with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, help me." My mom rushed forward, kneeling beside the girl and wrapping her arms around her. "It's okay, sweetie," she soothed. "We're here now. You're safe." But something felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a deep, gut-wrenching fear began to coil in my stomach. Then the girl smiled. Her lips stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that dripped with black ichor. Her eyes glowed with that same sickly green light, and the laughter, the awful, bone-chilling laughter, began again, louder than ever. Before we could react, the girl lunged at my mom, her small hands clawing at her face with inhuman strength. My mom screamed, stumbling back, but the girl was on her, tearing at her with a ferocity that defied her size. My dad raised the shotgun, but the girl was too close. He couldn't risk the shot. He charged forward, grabbing the girl, and yanking her off my mom, tossing her to the ground. But as soon as she hit the dirt, she was up again, her grin wider, more twisted, her body convulsing with sick laughter. "We have to go!" my dad shouted, pulling my mom to her feet. "Now!" We ran, leaving the clearing behind us, the girl's laughter echoing through the trees. But as we fled, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast we ran, no matter how far we went, we were never going to escape this nightmare. Because the farm wasn't just behind us anymore. It was inside us, and it wasn't going to let us go. We ran deeper into the woods, the girl's laughter chasing us through the trees. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo from every direction, surrounding us, taunting us. My mom's sobs were muffled by my dad's arm around her shoulders, as he practically dragged her forward. The terror in her eyes a reflection of the hopelessness we all felt. The ground beneath our feet grew softer, muddier, until we were practically wading through the earth. The smell hit me first, an overwhelming stench of decay and rot that clung to the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe. The soil here was different, darker, saturated with something that felt wrong. We stumbled into another clearing, but this one was different. There was no grass, no leaves, just bare earth, black and slick, as if something had seeped into the ground and poisoned it. In the center of the clearing was a large pit filled with the same foul-smelling mud that clung to our boots. It bubbled and churned as if something beneath the surface was alive. "We can't stop here," my dad said, his voice strained with fear and exhaustion. "We have to keep moving." But I couldn't take my eyes off the pit. There was something drawing me to it. Something deep within that black sludge that felt familiar, like a memory I couldn't quite grasp. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Then the mud began to rise. At first, it was just a few bubbles. But then a shape started to form, rising slowly from the pit. A hand, bloated and twisted, covered in decayed flesh, emerged from the muck, grasping at the air as if searching for something to hold on to. More of the creature followed, a body pulling itself free of the sludge, dragging itself toward us with slow, deliberate movements. It wasn't just one. More hands appeared, more bodies rising from the pit, all of them twisted and rotting, their eyes glowing with that same sickly green light. They weren't just the undead. They were part of the earth itself, born from the soil, from the poison that had seeped into the land, and they were hungry. "We have to go!" my dad shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The creatures were all around us, rising from the mud, crawling out of the trees, emerging from the ground itself. We were surrounded. My mom screamed as one of the creatures grabbed her ankle, its fingers digging into her skin. My dad fired the shotgun, but it barely slowed the thing down. I tried to pull her free, but the mud was sucking us down, dragging us closer to the pit, to whatever was lurking beneath the surface. Then, from behind us, the girl appeared again. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes glowing with that eerie green light, her smile wide and twisted. She watched us struggle, her laughter echoing through the trees. But this time, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was another figure, tall, gaunt, and draped in that same tattered farmer's coat. His face was hidden beneath the wide-brimmed hat, but I knew who he was. He was the one who had started all of this. The one who had brought the meteorite down to our farm. The one who had poisoned the earth. And he was smiling. "You thought you could run," the man said, his voice deep and hollow like the sound of wind through a graveyard. "But there's no escape. The farm is everywhere now. It's inside you. It's part of you." He reached up and slowly removed his hat, revealing a face that wasn't human anymore. His skin was cracked and blackened, his eyes glowing with that sickly green light. And beneath the surface of his skin, I could see something moving, writhing. Spores crawling through his veins, feeding off his flesh. "You're already dead," he said, his smile widening. "You just don't know it yet." I looked down at my hands, and that's when I saw it. The skin on my arms was turning gray, cracking, peeling away in patches. Beneath the surface, something was moving. Something alive, crawling through my veins, just like him. I stumbled back, horrified, but there was no escape. The spores had already taken root. They were inside me, inside all of us. We were part of the farm now. We had been since the moment the meteorite hit the earth. The creatures closed in, their rotten hands grasping at us, pulling us down into the mud, into the pit. My mom's screams were muffled as she disappeared beneath the black sludge, her hands clawing at the air for a brief moment before she was gone. My dad fired the shotgun until it clicked empty, but it was useless. The creatures swarmed over him, dragging him into the earth, his shouts drowned out by the sound of the mud churning around him. And then it was my turn. The mud was cold and thick as it pulled me down, wrapping around my legs, my arms, my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed over me was the girl's smile, her glowing eyes watching me as I sank beneath the surface. But I didn't die. I became part of the farm, part of the earth, and now I wait. I wait for the next ones to come, the next family, the next travelers, the next souls to wander too close to the cursed soil. Because the farm is always hungry, and it will never stop feeding.